We are in the book of James this morning. We are in chapter 3. Last week, you may remember, we dealt with the tongue. And as we did, opened up with the idea of don't rush to be a teacher. I do not believe that really we've left that subject. I believe we're going to continue with that as we now talk about wisdom, because the person that wants to teach needs to have wisdom. But there are two different kinds of wisdom. We're going to see that as we go through this study. So let's begin with verse 13, where he says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom." Start with the word wise. It's the word sophos, and it is, interestingly enough, that's where Sophia Leggett's name came from, is sophos. It's the old Greek word. It means wise. In Jewish usage, it has a knowledge of practical moral wisdom resting on a knowledge of God. And so that's real wisdom. Now we're going to talk about false wisdom as well, or worldly wisdom as we go through. Now, please notice that he says, let him show by good conduct. If you have a good understanding of moral teachings, if you know what God wants you to do, then it's going to be seen in the way that you live. That's the point that James is making. Now, compare this with what he's already said. Remember, you show me your faith. How? How are you going to show faith? By your works. It's going to demonstrate that you really have a belief in God. Well, this wisdom goes hand in hand with that. It's right beside it in a certain sense. of the word. Who is wise and understanding? That's the word that is used of a skilled or scientific person who has gained technical knowledge of a subject. It implies personal acquaintance and experience, not mere abstract knowledge. You ever known somebody that was just brilliant, but they couldn't do anything with it? Nothing practical. They just knew a lot. They knew really deep things, could explain deep things to you. But then when they went to putting it to work, didn't happen. I'll never forget a guy that was on the debate team with Teresa and me. I was on the debate more years than she was, but this young man he was brilliant, just brilliant. But just as an example, we were supposed to leave one night so we'd be where we were going and not have to push the next day to get to the bed. Nobody could find him. He's nowhere to be found. Where was he? He was locked in the science building, working on something. And so we had to get up really early the next morning and leave. He didn't even have a driver's license. I'm serious. Didn't even have one. So what good's all that knowledge, all that technical stuff? It's worthless if you can't use it, if you can't put it to work. So the word understanding carries that idea. And so a good teacher has both these things. They have the understanding of moral law that comes from God, and they know how to put it to work. They know how to apply it. And that's what we see in their life, is that they apply it in their day-to-day living. The word show is a word that means to give evidence or proof that something is true. I'll tell you what it instantly reminds me of, and that is people from Missouri, the show me state. You make a statement, they say, "Oh, you're going to have to show me that." That's kind of their approach to everything. And that is what James is saying. Conduct means you live what you teach. Think about Romans chapter 2, start at verse 17, and notice what the Apostle Paul says to the brethren at Rome as he talks about these things. Indeed, you're called a Jew and rest on the law and make your boast in God and know his will and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law. You therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written. So think about it. People hear a sermon from every Christian every day. You preach where you work. You might say, no, they don't let us do that. Oh yeah, they can't stop you because you're going to be respectable and honorable. You're going to do what's right, and people will observe it. I promise you, they will. They're going to notice that. If everybody in the office is in the habit of taking the pens home and the legal pads or whatever, and they say, you say, man, I really need something to write with at home. They say, well, just take one of those pens. No, that belongs to the company. I can't do that. I just have to stop by somewhere on the way home and get one. See, they're going to see a sermon in you. To me, one of the most detrimental things that a preacher could ever do is to not live up to his preaching. Now, you're going to fail every now and then. You're going to stumble. That's understood. Every Christian does. But in general, a preacher ought to be known as an honorable person. I'll never forget that my dad, we moved to Bolivar, Tennessee, and I had to have 2 major surgeries, 30 days in the hospital as a little bitty boy. And Dad was trying to pay his bills and asked the elders for just give me a small raise so I can pay these bills off. Well, part of the reason, of course, he was an honorable fellow, but part of the reason was when he got to town, they wouldn't let him leave his laundry to be done unless he paid them in advance, because the former preacher left him stuck with a bill. Well, you ruined your sermon, didn't you? What good's the preaching if you can't live it? And that's what James is saying about us as teachers. Ephesians 4 talks about it in a different way, really for every Christian. You have an approach that we need to take. Now listen to Paul as he pleads with them. I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long suffering, bearing with one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Some of the most difficult places that I've ever gone to preach meetings in were where you went and you found that the community thought of the church as a bunch of argumentative, bad-spirited people. Why? Well, they'd split. Kind of reminds me of the fellow that they found him on a deserted island. He'd been stranded for years, and he showed people around. They said, he said, "What's this building over here?" "Well, that's my house. That's where I live." They said, "Well, what's this building over here?" "Well, that's where I worship. That's a church building." And then they said, "Well, what's this other building?" He said, "Well, that's the other church I used to go to." Well, you see the problem. You see, you got to live consistent with what you teach, and if you don't, you're preaching a sermon that counters everything you've been saying with your mouth. So that's what is being said here. The word meekness here is shows how wise one really is. He does not have to go around boasting of his wisdom. It can be seen in his manner of life. So that's what we need to demonstrate. Meekness is desired by God and makes one approachable. Think about Psalm chapter 25, for example, verse 9. Here the singer of Israel deals with this idea. If I can get back to that. Psalm 25, verse 9. Listen to what he has to say. All right, he says, "The humble he guides in justice, and the humble he teaches his way." Now, explain to me why that would be true. You ever tried to teach somebody that was a know-it-all? One of the worst experiences of my life was in the very first year that I went to direct the school, and there was a young man there who obviously did not come to learn because when he disagreed with the teacher was always wrong, and so was everybody else, and there was no discussion. I don't mind somebody saying I'm wrong if you'll just discuss it with me. Maybe I am wrong. I'm willing to admit the possibility. He was not. And he ended up in disaster. He turned out to be a terrible thing for the church because he can't be taught. You and I have got to submit to God to be able to learn. That's meekness. That's humility. That's what we've got to have. All right, look at verse 14 where he goes on to say, "But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth." Envy here is the word zelos, out of which we get our word zeal, or the word zealous, as you might anticipate. And it can be used either way. In fact, in Titus chapter 2, verse 14, You may remember that he purchased us, gave himself for us that he might redeem us, and purify unto himself a peculiar people, watch it, zealous of good works. So zeal can be on the good side. And we don't want to think it's always bad. It's not always bad. But here, he's using it on the negative. And that happens sometimes because it doesn't come from knowledge. Look at Romans chapter 10. The Apostle Paul is describing the Jews, his fleshly brethren. He says in verse 1, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God." See, so they don't have a knowledge of God's word, and yet they profess that they're living right. You see, how do they do that? Well, they establish their own. This is their own way of living, their own righteousness, the way that Paul puts it in that passage. So we want to avoid that. Self-seeking is pushing forward for personal ends and partisanship. What's your main goal? Is it for you or for somebody else? One of the best ways you can tell the difference between a Christian and someone that's not a Christian is the Christian looks out for everybody else's needs. The person that's not a Christian only looks out for himself. And boy, we live in an age where that's the dominant feature, unfortunately. The word boast is to boast of one's affairs to the hurt of another person. And so you've got to be careful about how you talk. It could damage other people's lives. So in this case, these so-called wise teachers, in point of fact, are lying against the truth. How are they doing that? They claim to follow the truth, and their life says truth doesn't matter. God's truth is irrelevant. And unfortunately, again, probably all of us are aware of situations, individuals that their lives do that very thing. Christians need to put aside the bitter spirit of envy. Why? Because we're running the race together. Go back to Hebrews chapter 12, where he describes the Christian life like a like a marathon, but not your typical marathon. You know, New York City marathon's all laid out and people line the streets to cheer you on. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a marathon run through enemy territory. And that's the way it usually was run. A fellow would have a message. In fact, if you go back to the original, that was the idea. It's a message. He's got to run, but he's carrying it through enemy territory to get to the king or the general to let him know what's going on. So here we are in our life as Christians. Are we running through enemy territory in a certain sense? Are we living in enemy territory? I think that's what Jesus said in his prayer, John chapter 17. Don't you remember that one? Where he said, help them. I'm not asking you to take them out of the world, but instead, help them so that they don't let the world get in them. That's exactly the idea that he sets forth in his prayer. So, Hebrews 12, he's talking about that race, and start at verse 12. Therefore, strengthen the hands which hang down, the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but rather be healed. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord, looking carefully, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. Now, if you and I are running through enemy territory together and we get in a fight with one another, don't you figure the enemy's going to see us pretty quickly? We're calling attention to ourselves. Heard a true story the other day that I was just astounded by. This is a missionary working over in Asia, and he was walking from one place to another. He was hiking through the mountains, and he, for whatever reason, he decided not to light a fire that night, but he put on every stitch of clothing he had because he's in cold mountains. And when he finally got to where he was going the next day, they told him it's a good thing you didn't light a fire, because the area where you were staying is full of Bengal tigers, and the fire would have attracted attention. He might have been supper for one of those animals. You see, well, if we're running through enemy territory and you and I start fighting, the enemy's got perfect focus on us. So we don't need bitter envy. It attracts attention in a bad way. We don't need that. That shouldn't be part of us. In Ephesians chapter 4, it's for that reason that Paul gives the instructions that he does. And notice how he writes to them. Ephesians chapter 4, I want to pick up particularly at verse 31, right there at the end of the chapter, where he says, "Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you." So what's our goal? What's our ambition? Be kind to each other. Love each other. Care for each other. That's what attracts people to the gospel, or it ought to, is our love for each other. Think about Jesus, John chapter 13, where he says, that he set an example for them. He's their master, but he served them. He got down and washed their feet, and he said, "You need to do what I did. Love each other." That's the thing that attracts attention to us. Of course, Diotrephes in 3 John was quite different than that. He wanted to set himself up as the expert, even casting people out of the church, and he wouldn't let John's letter be read to those people. And John said he's going to take care of it when he got there. All right. Verses 15 and 16 of James chapter 3. "This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there." All right. So when you start talking about a so-called wisdom that's envious, that's constantly in conflict with its brethren, where does that originate? Well, I can tell you where it doesn't originate. That's what James says. It does not originate in heaven. Now remember, go back to chapter 1, where in verse... I want to say verse 14. Let me see if I'm right. Chapter 1, verse 14, where each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. We'll go on down. "Every good gift," verse 17, "every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning." God does not issue, nor does this kind of bad attitude come forth from him. And that's the point that James is making, that we need to understand. Instead of this wisdom coming from God, it really comes from the devil, earthly, sensual, devilish, or demonic. The demons are under the authority of the devil. And their goal is to destroy the church and destroy the influence of God's people. Where should it originate? Well, what we need to have is the wisdom that originates from God. Look at John chapter 8, verse 23. That's not the verse we usually look at. We usually look at verse 32, but this is a good point that we need to make here. John 8, listen to what he has to say, particularly at verse 23 in John 8. "And he said to them, 'You are from beneath, and I am from above. You are of this world. I am not of this world. Well, who's he talking to? The Jewish leaders. And if you watch the way they function, it doesn't, even Pilate, who is not a believer in any sense of the word, even he can see that they delivered Jesus to him for what reason? One only, envy. They couldn't stand the power that he had with the people, and they had to get rid of him. See, so notice that Jesus is well aware of that differentiation between the two. Look at Philippians chapter 3, where the Apostle Paul is describing actions that make him very sad in the lives of some Christians. Philippians chapter 3, we want to look particularly at verses 18 and 19. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who set their mind on earthly things. Okay, what does it mean their God is their belly? Give me a way you might explain that. Their appetite? Their appetite is their God? Is that what you're saying? Okay. Appetite. Okay. What does that mean? I don't disagree with that, by the way. What does that mean? I'm sorry? What they hunger for. What they pursue. Their own desires. Yeah. That's it. That's it. Their God is what they want. And that's all that matters. And whatever gets in their way to getting that, well, better look out. You're going to get hurt, if you're in their way when they're trying to get it. Now, beware of that type of attitude. Colossians chapter 3, Paul goes through a rather extensive discussion of that idea when he describes the difference in our focus, the focus of God's people versus the people of the world. Listen to the way he puts it. Colossians 3, we're going to begin at verse 1. If you then were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. You ever been engaged to somebody that was, great distance away? I was, in the sense of the word. Teresa was in Nashville. I was in Jackson, Tennessee. It's about 2.5 hours apart, but I was working every day with young people. I didn't have time to run back and forth. Guess where my mind was about half the time? It's in Nashville. Long conversations at night, on the phone, and that wasn't cell phone days. You had to pay for it, every time you talk. But that's where my mind was. If we really love God, if we really love Jesus, then where's our mind going to be set? It's going to be set on where Jesus is. Our sights are going to be set in heaven. So he goes on, set your mind on things above, not on things of the earth, for you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Therefore, put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience, in which you yourselves once walked, when you lived in them. But now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you put off the old man with his deeds, and to put on the new man, who's renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him. And I like the word renewed. It suggests you got to keep refreshing, you got to keep renewing it. I am not the guy to talk to about computers, but I understand one reason you have a screensaver is because it'll keep changing, and the image won't get burned into the screen. Now, I just told you more than I know, but the Christian has got to keep renewing his life so that, if you would, the picture, the image of his life is not distorted. It's where it ought to be. So it's a constant thing. That's why Paul talks about pleading with the brethren. I beseech you therefore, brethren, Romans 12, 1 and 2, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies living sacrifices, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So here's the contrast. It's very clear as we look through this what he's talking about. 1 John 2, not going to turn there. You all know that passage where he talks about what? Don't love the world? And how do you know what the world's like? Well, lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. That's the world. And you notice that every one of those is me-focused. Lust of the flesh is desire for me. Lust of the eyes is what I enjoy looking at. Pride of life, that's me being proud of me. I'm number one. That kind of thing. That's worldly thinking. That's not godly thinking. We've got to get away from that. All of those things, this false wisdom comes from an attempt to fulfill physical desires without retaining control over one's body. Look at the book of Jude. There's only one chapter, so you shouldn't have any trouble finding that. Verses 17 through 19, listen to what he says. But you, beloved, remember the words which were spoken before by the apostles of our Lord Jesus Christ, how they told you that there would be mockers in the last time who would walk according to their own ungodly lusts. These are sensual persons who cause divisions, not having the Spirit. You see, again, this contrast is going on. Where's their focus? It's all about self. It's all about what I feel and what I want, and that won't work. I want to talk about something I think is very, very important. I don't want anybody to be offended, but I want you to think about this. People that walk away from the church and say, I'm not going to go there anymore because that place is full of hypocrites, have the focus in the wrong place. Jesus is the focus. Will brethren stumble? You betcha. Will all brethren stumble? Well, every one of us will. But I don't worship to, don't take this wrong, but I don't worship to please you. I worship to please God. Now, a part of that worship is me encouraging you and you encouraging me. I understand that. But the first and the primary focus is please God. That's number one. And when you get to focus on self, we're in trouble, no matter what we're talking about. I think it's very important for us to see that. Notice that this kind of thinking, according to James, produces confusion, which is disorder, disturbance, trouble, instability. When you get a whole bunch of people wanting it their way, what ends up happening? You ever see children, when there's one toy everybody wants, say, boy, there's going to be a fight. Mine, mine, mine. And they're all saying the same thing. When they come to that, we can't be that way. It furthermore results in evil. The word evil here means bad, foul, vile. And thus it's not from God. Because God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, according to what Paul says, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33. Well, thankfully now, James shifts from worldly wisdom to godly wisdom. I don't really like talking all the time about worldly wisdom. Let's talk about the positive side now, and that's what he does. Verse 17, but the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now, Again, I don't know how you do your Bible. I'm not going to tell you how to do your Bible. Some people won't write in one at all. Some people write all over it. So you make your choice. But if I were one that writes in my Bible, and by the way, I am, so if I'm that kind of a person, then I'd go through here and I would begin to talk about these various things. Let's start with this first thing. Wisdom that is from above. You know, God gladly gives wisdom. If you look back to James chapter 1, isn't that a part of what he opened up with? I think it is. Look at verse 5 in particular of James chapter 1. And there he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. I've had this discussion very recently, not with somebody here, so don't be trying to figure out who it is. Here's what I try to say: you need to submit. Just ask God, what do you want me to do in this circumstance? Open my eyes, open my understanding, help me to appreciate where you want me to go. And then this person proceeded to tell me where they would not go. And it's like, well, then you're not open to God, are you? I'm only open if God will let me go where I want to go. You know, it's kind of like the preacher that retires and he only wants a place to preach in Florida. Well, that's, I don't dictate to God where I go. I just go where I think I'm needed, where I can do the most good. And I think that's the way we've got to be with our lives, our daily lives. We've got to be focused on doing the most possible good. Proverbs talks about these things. The wise man writes to his son, and he's trying to encourage him in the pursuit of wisdom. Look at Proverbs chapter 2. He's just barely gotten started there as he writes to him. And listen to what he has to say. Begin at verse 1 of Proverbs chapter 2. He says, my son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands within you, so that you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding. Yes, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you'll understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. So how are we going to get it? Well, you got to open up and let God, through his word, speak to you. That's the idea. And he will speak to you through his word if you'll let him. Teresa and I, in our reading this week, came across a passage. I was intrigued because I knew what she'd been studying on. I've been trying to help her. And we just, our daily Bible reading went right over this passage. I said, I'd never seen that before in my life. And I stopped the recording. And I said, I want us to look at this verse. She said, I'm waiting to see if it's the same verse that I'm interested in. And sure enough, we both focused on the same verse. Why? Because right there, God explained exactly. Now, we're talking particularly about Jesus being God. And as we read along, it said Jesus was the one that led the children of Israel through the wilderness. I don't believe I've ever seen that before. Ever. But boy, did it ever jump when I saw it this time. Because the Old Testament says God did. So is Jesus God? I think the answer is pretty obvious. Yes, he's God. Now, we can use other passages to prove that. But I'm just saying, be open to whatever God says. So, what does this wisdom contain within it? First of all, he says it's pure, which denotes that which is uncontaminated, without fault, holy, good. Let's say you're getting ready to eat your meal. And this has happened to some people. Getting ready to eat your meal, you've gone someplace special, and you got a bowl of soup, and you put your spoon down in the soup, and a dead mouse, comes up. Now, if I take the mouse out, will you go ahead and eat the soup? Me neither. I'm not going to do that. I do not consider that to be pure. Do you? Let's start with it. In fact, I'm not going to have a bowl from that place at all. I'm probably not going back, to be honest about it, because it's not pure. Well, the Christian life needs to be pure. That's the point. Purity is it should say is, not if, by the way, is first, because peace is procured by sacrificing one's convictions, or the plain teaching of God's word can never have the approval of God. See, he's going to go on and talk about peaceable, but you start with purity. You start with, you've got to follow the will of God if you want to arrive at the point of peace. That's the point. You got to follow God's will. And that came from Roper in his book on the book of James. Then we got the word peaceable, which means loving and promoting peace. If you love peace in an argument that is not about doctrine, it's not about clear teaching, it's just about opinions. If you want peace, will you yield? Yes, I see that. I see that head shake. Yes, that's exactly right. You'll yield. If you really want peace, I don't have to have my way. If somebody came along and said they wanted to paint these brick walls, I'm really violently opposed in my mind to painting brick. I think it's one of the dumbest things you can do. Brick has a color of its own. It's got a beauty of its own. Leave it alone. But if you all want to paint the bricks, I'm not going to make war over it. It's not worth the effort. I can ignore the brick with the paint on it. I'll just look. I won't watch it. Won't pay attention to it. It's not a principle. Doesn't matter. And now we're back to the thing that I learned when our children were young. Somebody taught me this. You got to learn the difference between principle and preference. Principle you fight for. Preference is just your opinion is this and my opinion is that, whatever the case may be, and it doesn't matter. It's not based on principle. So peaceable, pursuing it, loving it. God chastens us to produce peaceable fruit, resulting in people running well together toward God's grace. We already looked at that Hebrews passage, but now think, if we follow God, we're going to be at peace with each other, and we can run through enemy territory. We're not going to have to worry about the enemy spotting us because of our fussing and fighting, so to speak. God actually gave his son for peace. Jesus went to the cross so that we could have peace. With who? With God. We'd violated his will, but he sent his son. Now, how much did he love peace? We loved it enough he'd sacrificed the greatest thing he had, his own son. And we need to love it that much as well. Those making peace, by the way, are God's sons. Matthew 5:9 is Sermon on the Mount. It's one of the Beatitudes. Jesus brings that up. Then we got the word gentle in verse 17 also. It designates an attitude of forbearance, the exhibition of a disposition which does not demand its rights, but is willing, if necessary, to suffer wrong in the cause of right. You want to know a large part of what I think's wrong with this country right now? Everybody's focused on their rights. Now, I'm not talking about any one group. I'm talking about everybody. The majority of people in this country, they insist on their rights. If we take that approach, we're not going to get along with each other. Because sooner or later, my rights, as I see them, are going to cross with your rights as you see them. And thus we have friction all the time, going against each other. We don't need to be that kind of people. We need to be gentle. Those who would oversee God's flock, by the way, shepherds, elders, guess what? They've got to have this characteristic. They've got to have it. All Christians must have it. Titus talks about it. Paul does in writing to Titus, and Paul talks about it in the Philippian epistle as well. Then, willing to yield. That's defined as easily persuaded, willing to yield, compliant. The opposite of the word is disobedient. The word is used of submission to military discipline and for observance of legal and moral standards in ordinary life. Example, one who willingly submits to fatherly will. Now, we're submitting to the ultimate Father in the church. We're submitting to God the Father in the church. But this is a characteristic of Christians. We've got to be ready to yield. One with an open mind who can be persuaded to change when the facts are laid before him. Everybody's run into that person. Don't confuse me with the facts. My mind's already made up. Well, all the discussion's over, isn't it? We're not going to go anywhere. If I disagree with you, I'm just going to have to yield to you. It's the only thing I can do there. Wood says he's ever ready to hear what others have to say and willing to yield to what is right. Mercy refers to the capacity to be moved by the needs of others. The merciful person sees that the other one has a need and they're moved by it. They lean toward it. It's an active principle of compassionate love. Jesus repeatedly showed mercy in his walk on earth, and I've given you several examples of that. This wisdom bears good, wholesome, according to Moffat, fruits, not mere leaves or empty boasting. The plural, fruits, shows there is a variety and abundance for all. If it is not satisfied with abstract virtue, but wishes to bless others. Christians all need to bless other people. That needs to be our goal, our ambition. Now, Andy didn't know if I would have enough material for today. I've got too much material. We'll finish next week. Is that all right?